React Query is a phenomenal library. It pretty much single-handedly changed the way that we fetch our data in React and the way that we manage our asynchronous state. And as great as it is, you can actually use it the wrong way. A lot of developers, unfortunately, they just go directly to the documentation of React Query, they take the examples that they see there, and then they just directly apply them in their applications. The truth is that React Query actually goes way deeper than that, and there's a lot of really cool and useful things that you can add to your queries by just moving some things around to actually make the applications that you're building easier and more scalable. And so in this video, I want to show you some of these useful tips and tricks that I've learned over my years of using React Query so that hopefully you can build better React applications. So let's get into the video. All right, so over here, we have pretty much a very simple example of the simplest way of using React Query. So here I have this demo application. This is running with TanStack Start, but you don't need to have TanStack Start to get this working. However, TanStack Start and TanStack Router does integrate nicely with React Query because React Query is actually TanStack Query and they're part of the same stack. So here in this dashboard page component, what we have here is we pretty much have the simplest representation of the use query hook, the most fundamental hook when it comes to React Query. So here we have the query key, write current user, and then the associated query function, get current user function, which is basically going to be doing the fetching of getting our current user. And then of course we have our data, which we're aliasing here as the user, and then is pending, and then is error. And here we're checking is pending an error inside of the UI. Also this user here can be nullable because the user might not be signed in, and if not, we're going to redirect to the home page, and then we have here the actual UI that is going to get rendered once we have a user. Now this over here, like I said, is the simplest way to actually use React Query, but I'm going to tell you that I would not recommend that you do this inside of your applications, even if this is the actual example that you would see in the documentation of React Query. And for that, there's a couple of reasons. The first reason has to do with these query options over here, right? So in React Query, every single time that you create a query, you have to provide some query options. The query key here is basically used for the cache, right? So if you want to fetch this data in another component using the same query key, React Query is going to check against the cache and return to you the data from the cache if it's there and it's not been invalidated. And of course, you have the query function here that actually makes the fetch. But these options here could have anything else. For example, you could have here a stale time, you could have here a GC time, or any other specific configuration for this specific query. And the problem with listing all of these query options here directly inside of the component, what you're essentially doing is you're hard coding these values over here, which makes them not really easy to be reused in other places in your application. For example, imagine you had another component that also wanted to get access to that same current user, right? For example, here we have this user form over here. I'm just going to go into it quickly. This one over here also wants to get access to this user over here. The way that we currently have this set up, we would basically have to copy all of these options here and also put them inside of this user form component. This is repeating ourselves and this is not efficient, right? So even though there's nothing directly wrong with using React Query like this, I mean, after all, this is how you see it in the official documentation. And by the way, this is already so much better than doing it traditionally with a use effect. There still are some things that you can do here to actually make this even better. Now, typically, the first thing that I see developers do is they're going to extract all of this inside of a custom hook, like we have here. I'm going to open up here this use current user, and this is basically the same exact query, but now it's extracted in a custom hook that we have here, use current user. This is doing the same thing here, right? Query key, query function, and all the options here. And now we can use that hook instead of actually hard coding the values directly wherever we want to use them. And this honestly is not a bad solution. I've done this personally myself in a lot of applications, but even though it is technically one step better, there still are some drawbacks with using a custom hook like this. So while it is great that now we have these query options here that are extracted in a custom hook, so every single place that we use this use current user hook here is going to benefit from having all of these same query options here. The thing that we don't have here is we don't have the flexibility of using this with any hook that we want, right? With this, we're actually forced to use the use query hook specifically. But what if we don't want to use the use query hook? What if we want to use something else, like use suspense query, for example? Or what if we, because we are using here TanStack Start with TanStack Router, what if we instead want to actually prefetch these data over here based on these query options inside something like ensure query data, right? Which is not a hook and it goes outside of any React component. The fact that we have this in a custom hook, we have that restriction that now this custom hook is hard coded to come with use query. Right? And so even this is not a perfect solution. And lately, I've been finding myself in my own applications no longer ever creating any of such custom hook. Instead, let me show you a different solution that actually gets you all of the benefits of having everything reusable without any of the restrictions of having to use any specific hook. So for that, we're going to come here in the same folder that we have our use current user over here. And here I'm going to open up the query options file over here. And here you're going to see something that is very similar. So here we don't have a hook. We instead have a function that we're exporting. And this function is called create current user query options. This one, the only thing that it does is it simply returns the query options, the same query options that we had before. And these query options here come directly from React Query. Basically, what this is doing is this is taking only the parts of the query that we actually care to be reusable, which are the query options themselves, right? The query key and so on, but none of the hooks, which now means that we can take these query options here. We can take this function, we can call it. And the reason why, by the way, it's a function is that a lot of times you want to provide some arguments here. Say, for example, you are fetching a specific user based off of its ID. You would pass the ID here as an argument and then pass it here in the query key. In this example, we don't have it, but that's generally the reason why these you want to have them as a function. You can then come here and you can use these query options directly in this query over here. So what I can do is I can come here, I can replace all of this and I can do create here and I can import current user query options like this and I can call it. And now I have the same exact benefits, the same exact query. Everything that is to be reusable is actually reusable, but now I can use this with use query. I can come here, I can use this with suspense query like this. Right? I can use this with any hook that I actually want to do. And this is a great thing that you can do for your queries because again, the only thing that is really reusable that you care about are these query options over here. So these are the only things that you should actually make reusable in your application. Now, furthermore, what you can also do and what I would recommend that you do is this query key here is still hard-coded inside of these query options over here, which means that if you want to have a mutation that is going to come and invalidate a query, you do that using a query key. You have no way to actually access that query key from another place without really having to dig into React Query. And here, the solution is actually very simple and very elegant. What I generally do is inside of the folder over here, I have a constants file over here. I'll open up the constants file, and this one exports here a global constant that is auth query keys. And here I have the actual query key itself that I can directly use and import inside of my options. So here what I can do, I can come back here and instead of doing this over here, I can do auth like this, import auth query keys, and then put here current user. And now I have the same exact thing, but now my query key itself is actually reusable, and I can then invalidate it from any other component by just importing this constant over here. It's small things, but it really adds up because now your queries themselves are super flexible, super composable, and you can use individual pieces anywhere that you want in your application with very little complexity. Right, so that's the first few things that you can really do, the very low-hanging fruit, if you will, when it comes to your queries to really make everything better. Now, let's come back here to our main component, and now let me talk to you about something that is a little bit broader than just the queries themselves, and that is to think about what the component should actually do and if the component should be responsible for actually fetching the data itself. So let me come back here, let me remove this suspense here, let's just put use query like we had before. Let's look at what we have here. Because currently this component over here is actually responsible end to end of actually doing the fetch, right? That's what this use query hook here is going to do. It is basically going to fetch the data using the query function whenever this component mounts, which also means that this component is responsible for the is pending flag, right? And also the error flag as well. And with this, there's two problems that arise. The first problem is a little bit obvious, but maybe not because this is still a simple component, which is that this is bloating the component quite a lot because now the component has to deal with is pending, right? Whenever the query is in a pending state, has to deal with an error, has to render out the error here as well, right? Maybe we also want to capture this to send it to Sentry or stuff like that. So we'll have to add that functionality in there. And the component is also responsible for redirecting if we don't have a user, right? So that's a lot of things to put in one component when really the component itself in React should mostly be responsible for rendering the user interface, not for data fetching, right? So that's one thing that if you were to move this query outside of the component, you would simplify the component quite a lot. Now, there's another thing which can actually impact performance, which is that every single time that you have use query inside of any component, your component is basically going to re-render multiple times. So initially on the first mount, on the first render of the component, it is going to render with the data being undefined, because every query using useQuery here starts off as undefined until it is actually fetched. The fetching is an asynchronous operation, and so there's one render with the data being undefined. Then after that, the query is going to be fetched. Maybe it's already in the cache. If so, it's not going to hit the backend. It's going to return the data directly from the cache. If not, it is going to make a fetch to the backend. Regardless, that is an asynchronous operation. That's going to cause a second render of the component here. Now with the data actually being resolved and is pending here actually being false, right? Because now the data is resolved. In the case of an error, of course, you're not going to have data, you're going to have an error, but regardless, you're still going to get a second render. And in React, it's generally a good idea to try to avoid as many renders as you can without obsessing over them, because you shouldn't really obsess about having no renders. Re-renders are good, but generally, if something doesn't necessarily need to be here and it's causing re-renders, you want to maybe try to avoid it, because every render of this dashboard page component here is basically going to render everything that is within it, right? That is how React works. And every single component inside of it is also going to render unless it has been memoized, which usually is not really going to cause any problems. But of course, if you have a component that is expensive, that is doing a lot, it will cause some problems. But again, if you can avoid it, you should. And by the way, all of this is with one query over here, which is a rather simple example for the sake of the video. Typically, in a component like this, you would have multiple queries. Maybe some of them depend on other queries. And so you're not actually getting 2 renders. You're getting maybe like 4, 6, 8 renders sometimes. And you can imagine that all of these are basically cascading into all of your components here. And so to solve all of that, there's actually one thing that will solve every single problem that I listed here, which is to move the actual data fetching at the navigation level, right? So this is where you see the reason why I have 10 stack start here with 10 stack router. We can actually do all of this inside of the loader itself, right, at the navigation level, and then just assume that the component is going to have the data, because the component is actually not going to get rendered until the data is there. So we can directly access the data using what I will show you, a suspense query, to actually make the component directly have the data and only be responsible for the user interface. And then your navigation, your loader, actually gets responsible for loading and fetching the data that is needed for the specific page. So in the case of 10 stack start, this is how this looks like. You come here and you do a loader over here. We're going to do a loader. We're not going to call these functions over here. We're going to do an asynchronous here. Then we're going to do exactly this over here. We are going to use the context here. Again, don't worry too much about the context specifically. We're basically going to access the query client, which React Query uses for all of its data and all of its caching. And then we're simply going to call ensure query data and pass it here the create current user query options. Now you can see the benefits of having these as a separate function over here, right, to render out these options here, because we can use them not just with a hook. This here is not a hook. It's not part of any component. And we couldn't do that with this use current user hook. That's why I generally don't recommend that you create these hooks over here, and instead recommend that you create separate query options. Now with this, the data fetching is actually going to happen here inside of this loader before this component ever has a chance to render. And oftentimes, depending on how you set things up, before the actual JavaScript bundle of the component has even actually loaded. So this is really more efficient than loading everything in a component, because doing it this way with useQuery, you actually have to first wait for the component to get mounted and to render initially before you trigger that fetch, which is not the most efficient thing that you can do. And so then over here, what you do is you actually convert this into a suspense query over here. And again, you pass the same query options, and suspense queries basically assume that the data fetching is going to get fetched outside of the component, and the component here is going to suspend to the nearest boundary until that is done. In our case, 10 stack start and 10 stack router actually implement that suspense boundary for us automatically, so we don't have to do it. And then you can see here the data here is actually already there. Now in our case, it can still be null, because again, we may or may not have assigned an user, but there's no more pending state and there's no more error state, because all of these happen directly at the level of the route through this loader over here. Which also means that this over here, we can also take this check here for the user and put it directly inside of the loader directly. And here we can just do const and then user equals this. And now we have the same exact function over here, but now we basically put it inside of the loader. And here we don't return, we throw a redirect just like this. And now automatically TanStack start is going to handle all of this. So now in this component here, we're guaranteed to have a user here. Again, we have to check here that we don't have a user because the user can be null, right? So we can just do it like this, right? To make things a little bit simpler. But now the fetching is done outside of the component. And look at this. Look how simple our component is now, right? It's no longer bloated with all of this logic to check all of these different things. It just has one line of code to actually get the data, and that's it. And this is really the modern way of using React Query, and that's the power of integrating it with your navigation solution. Again, this doesn't only work with TanStack Start, this also works with React Router. In the case of Next.js, it is a little bit different because Next.js has server components, and you're doing the fetch still in a component, but outside of a client component. The problem is not really fetching inside of a component. The problem is fetching inside of a client component, right? You want to generally avoid fetching in a client, put it either in a loader or put it in a server component if you have access to those. And finally, let me show you here this user form, because now this kind of completes this whole pattern over here. If we see this user form over here, it is wrapped in Suspense with a fallback here loading form. The reason why we did that is because in the user form over here, we're also using a Suspense query to get access to the same user. And this might seem counterproductive. I've had a lot of developers actually ask me, is it good to actually have multiple queries in multiple components? Or should we just get the data once, maybe in this component, or even return it from the loader here, which you can do, and then pass it through props to all of these components? And my answer to that is that generally you kind of have the flexibility to arrange things in the way that you want, but React Query really shines by using multiple components like this, right? And then accessing that same shared piece of data. You can really think about all of these Suspense queries here and all of the actual React Query hooks as a context API that is basically using a hook to access that same value inside of a context. It's just that in this case, the context is the query client and it's generally the entire cache. And so it's completely fine to have multiple components like this accessing the same piece of data without passing it through props, because again, the only thing that you're repeating here is the actual hook itself, which is not really a problem. All of the query options, everything else that needs to be reusable, is shared, so that's all fine. Right, so over here, we have a Suspense query. So this component automatically gets the user. There's no loading. There's nothing else that we have to handle. And we can directly implement and use this user inside of this component. For example, over here, we have a mutation here. And here you can see the power of actually extracting our query keys, right, in a separate constants file. Because now this mutation over here, we're passing in here the update current user function over here. And then once we're done, we're basically going to await the invalidation of the query key of the current user, which we can easily do because we can reference the current user constant, the query key, inside of our constants file. And then over here, we have this simple button, right? If we don't have a user, we're just going to return because again, the user can always be nullable. And then we simply call the update user mutation. We pass it here our data, and here we can access the user over here that we directly get from our Suspense query. And this essentially completes the cycle where we have our queries and we have our mutations and everything is super efficient. And so that's really it. That's all that it takes to use React Query the right way. And as you can see, it's not really that difficult. It's quite simple. All that you have to do is basically follow something that is also applicable generally in programming, which is to make things small and reusable. Put everything in its separate place, right? Compose your applications together using those small pieces, and you will be able to have a lot of complexity without any complexity in any of the individual parts. And that's really how you build beautiful, great, and scalable React applications. Now, if you watched this far into the video, first of all, thank you so much. I genuinely really appreciate your time. And I would also want to tell you about Cause and Code, if you haven't heard, which is my new coding platform that teaches you everything that you need to have a successful career as a full stack React developer. This platform for now has a bunch of interactive courses. They're super great. They're super in-depth. I really go deep to try to actually explain to you all the concepts. But the really exciting part is the guided projects that are going to have here, because the projects are actually going to have you put in practice everything that you learn in all of these courses and really cement your own skills and success as a full stack React developer. If you want to check out all of the courses that we currently have and the ones that are planned for the future for the entirety of next year, come here to the roadmap. If you want to check out the leaderboards to see all of the users that are currently working in their applications, come here and get some motivation because you can be a part of them and you can maybe even be number one if you choose. You'll find the platform at causedandcode.com, or you can simply click the first link in the description down below. I would love to see you on there. So there you go. That's it. That's all that I have for this video. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to leave it a big thumbs up. You can also click here to subscribe, or you can click here to watch a different video of mine that YouTube seems to think that you're really going to enjoy. And with that being said, my name has been Darius Causen. This is Causen Solutions. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.